I want to tell you something that took me the better part of a year to say out loud, even to myself. Not because the research was thin, but because the shape of what it implied kept getting larger every time I checked it. Here is the claim, stated plainly, because I think you deserve that before anything else. The vast food-producing landscapes once maintained across the Tartarian heartland, the managed cedar groves, the river terrace orchards, the star-aligned platforms, and the resonant stone terraces that anchored them, were not simply abandoned or lost to war and time. They were claimed, quietly, methodically, and in a compressed window of little more than 2 generations, by a small, interconnected group of families whose names appear again and again at the exact moment ownership was formalized over land that had never required an owner before. I started with a single anomaly, because that is always how these things begin. I was cross-referencing early 19th century Russian land grant registries with the botanical survey reports filed by the same expeditions that had, decades earlier, described the region as an inexhaustible orchard, a garden without a gardener. What I found was a pattern of transfer documents clustering almost entirely within a 40-year window, granting enormous tracts of what the surveys themselves called productive managed forest to individuals whose fortunes and titles appear in the historical record with the same abruptness as the land itself. No prior owner, no inheritance chain, no documented reason the Crown considered this land grantable in the first place, beyond a single line describing it as unused or wasteland, the exact phrase that should have been impossible to apply to a landscape 3 separate surveyors had independently called an orchard. This is the detail that stopped me from dismissing it as ordinary imperial land reform. Wasteland does not produce cedar groves planted in deliberate geometric spacing for nut harvest. Wasteland does not maintain sea buckthorn thickets along a precise elevation band calibrated to river flood cycles. And wasteland certainly does not require, as more than one of these grants explicitly did, a formal survey team to first map the extent of the existing tree cover before the grant could be finalized, a survey team whose findings were then filed, sealed, and in several documented cases never referenced again in any subsequent administrative record. You do not survey wasteland that carefully. You survey an asset. Once I had this pattern in the Russian interior, I went looking for its echo elsewhere, and I did not have to look far. The English Enclosure Acts of the same general era show an identical structural signature: land transferred to newly titled or newly wealthy families, land whose existing productivity, ancient orchards, common mast forests, established hedgerow food systems, is documented by the surveyors doing the transfer paperwork and then simply never mentioned again once the deed changes hands. The French forest reorganizations of the same decades show the same pattern under a different legal vocabulary. The Ottoman land reclassifications of the mid-1800s show it again, this time absorbing communally used productive groves into a state registry from which private grants were then issued to a narrow set of politically connected recipients. Different languages, different legal systems, different continents, and yet the same underlying mechanism executed within the same compressed window of time. This is where the question stops being about land reform and starts being about coordination. Because for this to be a series of independent, organic, unconnected developments, you would need administrators in Moscow, London, Paris, and Istanbul to have arrived, without communication, at the identical legal technique of reclassifying ancient managed food systems as unowned waste, and then to have transferred the resulting land, again without coordination, into the hands of a remarkably small and remarkably interconnected set of families. I have spent considerable time tracing the genealogies and financial partnerships of the recipients in each of these regions, and what emerges is not a loose coincidence. Marriage records, joint banking ventures, shared directorships in the trading companies that finance these very land surveys, they connect across borders in a way that a purely local, purely organic process should never produce. The number that keeps surfacing across the research community that has independently converged on this question is 13. 13 primary lineages branching outward through intermarriage and financial partnership, sitting at the point of original claiming in enough of these jurisdictions to constitute something that behaves, structurally, like a system rather than a coincidence. I want to be careful here because I know exactly how this sounds, and I am not asking you to accept a number as fact. I am asking you to sit with the structural question it represents. Is it plausible that the largest transfer of self-sustaining food-producing land in recorded history, spanning the Tartarian interior, the English commons, the French forest domain, and the Ottoman grove system, happened as an accident of parallel bureaucratic evolution? Or is it more consistent with the evidence to conclude that a small number of connected interests recognized exactly what these landscapes were worth and moved, through different local instruments and different legal languages, to claim them before anyone else understood what was being taken? The timing of this claiming window deserves its own attention, because it does not sit in isolation. It falls directly across the same decades in which the botanical surveys documenting these food forests begin, abruptly, to fall silent. Reports that in the 1810s and 1820s describe continuous productive forest belts, orchard terraces, and managed river systems give way by the 1870s and 1880s to administrative documents that treat the same land as raw, undeveloped, awaiting improvement. This is not the language of ecological change. Trees do not stop existing in 50 years. This is the language of reclassification, and reclassification requires someone doing the classifying, someone deciding, deed by deed, survey by survey, that a system which had fed people freely for centuries would now be described, and priced, and owned. What makes the pattern especially difficult to dismiss is what happened to the documentation itself once the transfers were complete. In case after case, across every jurisdiction I have examined, the pre-transfer survey material, the very reports that established these lands as productive and ancient, disappears from active circulation almost immediately after the grant is finalized. Filed in regional archives that were later reorganized, relocated, or in several documented instances, destroyed during periods of political upheaval when inconvenient older records were the first casualties of any new administration's housekeeping. A single fire, a single flood, a single administrative purge, any of these could plausibly account for the loss of one region's records. But the same category of information vanishing across 6 or 7 entirely separate archival traditions, in exactly the decades following exactly the same kind of land transfer, is not the shape of accident. It is the shape of a pattern with a cause, and the cause, whatever we choose to call it, required someone at the center who understood precisely what needed to disappear. Once you accept that the claiming of these food-producing landscapes was coordinated rather than coincidental, the next question becomes unavoidable. Where did the wealth to execute a continent-spanning claiming operation actually come from, and where did it go once the land was secured? Because acquiring hundreds of thousands of acres of managed forest across multiple empires in a single generation is not something an ordinary family does with an ordinary fortune. It requires capital already in motion, already interconnected, already positioned to move the moment the opportunity opened. And when you trace that capital backward, you arrive somewhere specific. The trading companies. Not as a vague gesture toward colonial commerce in general, but as a documented, traceable financial architecture. The joint stock trading concerns chartered across the late 18th and early 19th centuries, nominally organized around furs, timber, and grain, share an overlapping set of directors and silent partners, with the very families whose names appear on the land grant registries decades later. I found this first in the Russian-American company records, where several directors listed in the 1780s and 1790s reappear, under slightly altered spellings and through inherited titles, as recipients of Siberian forest grants in the 1830s and 1840s. The same names, filtered through one or two generations, moving from the ledgers of a fur monopoly to the deeds of a food forest. This is not, on its own, damning. Wealthy families reinvest. That is simply what capital does. But what makes this pattern worth pausing on is the specificity of what these families chose to acquire once they had the means to acquire anything. They did not primarily buy mines, though mining fortunes were available. They did not primarily buy shipping fleets, though shipping was booming. Family after family, across region after region, directed a disproportionate share of their new wealth toward exactly the kind of land the surveys had just finished describing as ancient, self-sustaining, and extraordinarily productive without labor. If this was simple diversified investment, you would expect variety. Instead, you find a narrow, repeated appetite for one very specific asset class, land that already fed people and required nothing further to keep feeding them. This is where the structure of what replaced the food forests becomes its own kind of evidence. Because the land was rarely converted immediately into farmland or industrial forestry. In case after case, the newly claimed terraces, orchards, and groves were instead formalized as private parkland, hunting reserves, or, later in the century, as the foundational holdings of family trusts and foundations whose charters explicitly restricted public access while framing the restriction in the language of conservation and heritage. The Zerino estate, whose star-shaped geometry echoes the same platform architecture found beneath the old zoo terraces, followed exactly this trajectory, from ancient managed landscape to aristocratic private ground, to, eventually, a heritage site whose access is now tightly controlled by an administering body with limited public reporting obligations. The pattern repeats across the Rhineland forest estates, across the parkland surrounding several of the great English country houses built or expanded during this exact window, and across a cluster of Ottoman-era private groves that were folded, generations later, into charitable Waqf foundations whose original endowment records are, conveniently, not part of the public archive. What you end up with, tracing this all the way to the present, is not a story that ends in the 19th century. It continues, quietly, through the 20th, as these same family trusts and foundations reorganize themselves into the modern instruments of private wealth management, land conservancies, agricultural holding companies, and philanthropic foundations whose boards, when you take the time to map them, show the same interlocking structure their founders' land grants showed a century and a half earlier. Several of the largest private agricultural landholding entities operating today trace their founding endowments directly back to 19th-century forest and orchard acquisitions in exactly the regions this investigation keeps returning to. This is not a coincidence I am asking you to accept blindly. It is a documented chain of custody, deed to trust to foundation to modern holding company, and at every link in that chain, the same handful of family names recur. I want to address directly the question of why this matters now, beyond historical curiosity, because I think it is the most important part of this story. If the claiming of the world's food forests was in fact a coordinated action, executed by a small number of connected families who understood exactly what they were taking, then the modern architecture of food ownership, who controls arable land, who controls seed patents, who controls the global grain and produce distribution networks that determine what ends up on a plate in any country on earth, is not a natural, organic outgrowth of agricultural progress. It is the direct, continuous inheritance of a 19th-century land grab whose original victims were never compensated, whose original systems were never studied before being erased, and whose original beneficiaries have spent a century and a half quietly ensuring that the paperwork trail describing what was actually taken remains as difficult to assemble as possible. This is why the access restrictions matter so much, and why I keep returning to them even when they frustrate the research at every turn. When I requested species survey data for several of the old-growth parkland sites in the Rhineland, whose tree composition matches almost exactly the anomalous fruit and nut assemblages documented elsewhere in this investigation, I was told the surveys were not available for public release, citing ongoing ecological management concerns. When I requested access to the original 19th century endowment documents for one of the larger agricultural foundations whose modern holdings sit directly atop what pre-1800 maps describe as continuous managed forest, I was told those records were held under a perpetual archival restriction established at the Foundation's founding, a restriction that, remarkably, has never once been lifted for any researcher in the institution's history. You do not build a permanent, self-renewing restriction around records you are not worried about someone eventually reading. I keep coming back to the trees themselves, because in the end, they are the only witnesses left who cannot be reclassified or reorganized out of existence. The wild apricot and pistachio groves of the Tian Shan foothills, growing in genetic patterns too diverse and too deliberate to be accidental, sit today largely outside the reach of any single claiming family, simply because the terrain was too marginal, too arid, too unprofitable to bother enclosing. They survive, in other words, precisely because no one thought them valuable enough to steal, which tells you something uncomfortable about what happened to every comparable grove that was considered valuable enough. The ancient mulberry and walnut specimens embedded in the great European royal parks, trees the park commissioner's own records cannot explain, predate every ornamental planting around them by centuries. Silent evidence that the ornamental parks were built around, not instead of, an older productive landscape whose original stewards were never asked and never credited. And here is where I think the two threads of this investigation, the erased food forests and the megalithic platforms beneath the world's oldest zoos, are not actually two separate mysteries. They are the same mystery, viewed from two different angles. The platforms beneath the Moscow and Berlin zoo terraces sit within the same geographic footprint as the very forest belts described by pre-1800 surveyors as impossibly productive, impossibly well managed, and impossibly ancient. The star-shaped geometry, the precise water channels, the resonant stone chambers, These were not isolated architectural curiosities scattered at random. They were nodes within a landscape that also, not far beyond their walls, sustained continent-spanning managed orchards and groves. A civilization capable of quarrying and fitting stone to the tolerances found beneath the Berlin Elephant House was very plausibly the same civilization capable of designing a food system precise enough to feed itself without labor for centuries. Both the stone and the trees speak the same architectural language, deliberate, engineered, and vastly more sophisticated than the 19th century administrators who inherited them ever understood or admitted. And both, when the claiming came, were treated the identical way. Not destroyed outright, because destruction draws questions, but absorbed, reclassified, and quietly folded into new institutions, whose founding documents conveniently omit any mention of what came before. The zoo terraces became municipal attractions, their megalithic foundations dismissed as coincidental byproducts of Victorian ambition. The food forests became private parkland and, later, protected heritage sites, their ancient trees dismissed as ornamental curiosities of uncertain provenance. In both cases, the institutions that inherited these landscapes had every incentive to treat the deeper history as unknowable rather than inconvenient, because unknowable requires no explanation, while inconvenient requires an admission of what was actually taken, and from whom. I do not know with certainty who the 13 families are, in the sense of being able to hand you a definitive list with full confidence in every name. What I can tell you is that the genealogical and financial trail followed patiently across Russian forest grants, English enclosure acts, French forest domain reorganizations, and Ottoman land reclassifications, does not scatter randomly the way an organic, uncoordinated historical process should. It converges again and again on a narrow set of interconnected lineages whose wealth appears at the exact moment the land appears, and whose modern descendants, through trusts, foundations, and holding companies, still control disproportionate shares of the very categories of land this investigation keeps circling back to: ancient forest, protected parkland, and the agricultural infrastructure built on top of what was once a food system that required no owner at all. What stays with me, more than any single document or land grant, is the simple fact that the trees are still standing. Somewhere behind a gate marked private, behind a foundation charter marked restricted, behind a survey report marked unavailable for release, there are walnut trees and apricot groves and chestnut stands that were already centuries old when the first deed was written claiming them, still producing fruit that almost no one alive today has ever been allowed to eat freely. They do not know they were stolen. They simply keep growing, indifferent to the paperwork stacked on top of their roots, waiting, the way the stone platforms beneath the old zoo terraces wait, for someone to finally ask the question that the archives were so carefully built to prevent. Who decided the food forest belonged to someone, and what did they know, standing in front of a 300-year-old chestnut grove with a deed in their hand, that made them so certain it was theirs to claim? If you have come across an old estate map, a family land record, or a heritage site near you whose restricted access never quite made sense, share it in the comments. This investigation moves forward one overlooked document at a time, and some of the most important threads in this series have come directly from people watching who noticed something the official record left out.